Hate to turn it off. But that was, of course, Nachamu Nachamu Ami, the famous Shlomo Carlebach melody for this Shabbos that we just came out of, the first Shabbos of consolation. We came out of Tisha B'Av last week, and now on the Haftorah that we read this morning, Isaiah the prophet tells us, be comforted, Ami, my people. Speaking in the voice of the Lord, be comforted, no matter how bad things might seem. The Lord is always with us, and the Lord has a plan. Good Vach, Shavua Tov. It's great to be with you, my holy sisters and brothers. Starting the week off with some beautiful learning on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Saturday night? Sharon in New Jersey, Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Paula in Chicago, Ryan in Jacksonville, Florida, Misty in Oregon, Christo in Lubbock, Tom says Shavua Tov, Patrice in Utah, John in Maine, Nancy in North Carolina, Christo, what is that? I decided to get all the PDF files from Corin on my iPad and Mac, which is a great way to make your way through the Talmud. It just doesn't work during Shabbos, but certainly after Shabbos. Zach Plotzker, recovery is going amazing. I am so glad to hear that. Yitzhak Shlomo ben Mirel Devor, I'm always davening for you, and I will keep doing that until we hear that you are 100%. But thank you so much for the update. Thrilled to hear that you are well. Lewis in North Carolina. It skipped on me. In Northern California. Carol wishing us a Shavua Tov, and over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. We're continuing our journey through Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of marriage contracts. We're in chapter 3, completing our discussion of Mishna number 2 and opening our discussion of Mishna number 3 tonight. Generally speaking, this chapter has been about this intersection with the law of marriage contracts and the minimum sort of prenup that a man would sign up for when marrying a woman, that if he divorces her, he's going to have to give her this marriage settlement. And if she came into that marriage as a virgin, so then she gets a larger marriage contract, as it were. So how does a woman who, didn't, through no fault of her own, comes into the marriage not a virgin, in this chapter discussing what if she was raped or what if she was seduced? How does that affect this law? And in the case of rape, the Torah had this special provision that in addition to the damages that the rapist would owe if he hurt her, if he humiliated her, if he caused her to have loss of livelihood, etc., also there's a specific fine that he pays, and he's forced to marry her, and he can never divorce her if she wants to marry him. She doesn't have to, of course. But that fine only applies in very specific circumstances. It's not for a minor. It's not for a grown woman. It's for this defined young woman, a girl who's entered puberty but hasn't become a full adult yet and is still under the authority of her father in her father's household. That's generally where we are. And at pertaining to this discussion, because there was this idea that he owes a fine and he has to marry her, well, if he's prohibited from marrying her, does he still owe the fine? So then we've also seen how different penalties intersect with each other. And the general principle has been that if a man is subject to the death penalty for a crime that he committed, and at the same time that he murdered someone, he also, damaged property belonging to the victim or the victim's family, etc., or came liable for some other fine, like the fine for rape, that he doesn't pay the fine because he's executed. And that exempts him from liability to pay the monetary damages. And likewise, if he's sentenced to whipping, right? If he's going to get lashes, if he's flogged, also he's exempted from paying the monetary penalty. And we've been really going a deep dive about how does the Torah reveal that that is the principle. It doesn't seem to say so explicitly. And so the sages have been debating what exactly is the source in the Torah for that principle. We picked this up at the bottom of page 37b. Our daf tonight is page 38 here in Tractate Kesubos. The Gemara asks, and didn't you incidentally learn the following conclusion from the verse, Numbers 35:31, and you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, which seems to be saying that one who is subject to the death penalty, he can't get out of it by paying money, neither to the victim nor to the court. If he is subject to the death penalty and he's been convicted and all the legal requirements have been met, he was warned, he did it anyway, there were witnesses, they testified, the whole thing, then he's going to receive the death penalty. There's no money that he can pay in order to get out of it. Now, so didn't we incidentally learn from that verse, do not take money from him and exempt him from death? Why then do I require the phrase in a different verse, any cherem, which we were discussing yesterday? See, that first of all, that verse that we just read, do not take ransom from him, maybe what it means is, well, if he's executed, he doesn't pay any monetary damages, but we've been learning it as, if he's subject to be executed, he can't get out of it by paying money. A little bit different. We had another verse that taught that no cherem, no valuation can be taken. And the way the sages interpreted that is somebody could vow to make a donation to the temple according to the value of a person or according to the valuation of a person. According to the value of a person is like what a person would be worth if they were sold into slavery. So in the slave market, what that person would be worth. And then he could say, I'm going to pledge the value of myself, if I were sold into slavery, or the value of such and such individual, and I will, pledge that as the amount of my donation to the temple. Or that's value. Or different term, valuation, which is this cherem, which is actually a Torah-specific valuation, which has nothing to do with how strong or experienced or smart you are, or anything like that, but simply according to your age and gender, the Torah ascribes certain values, that if you make a vow for that valuation, that's how much you owe as your donation to the temple, because you made a pledge to give that much money. So, but now in this context, the sages are saying maybe we can learn from that same verse that a person, and if somebody is condemned to die, right, he's going to receive the death penalty, and you say, I pledge his valuation or his value as a donation to the temple, you've said nothing at all, because one who is condemned to die cannot get out of it. So his life is worth nothing. He's on his way to his execution. So why then do I require this phrase, any cherem? And Rami Bar Chama said, it is necessary, as it might enter your mind to say, now we're on 38a, that this principle that one cannot pay in lieu of being executed applies only when one intentionally killed him in an upward motion for which no atonement is designated in the Torah for its unwitting performance. Lots of principles are involved in this, so to unpack that a little bit, recall that we also said that in the law of exile to a city of refuge, right? This is the law of the manslaughter. Somebody who did not engage in premeditated murder, but something happened, right? Something happened, and it's a little unclear, was it purely an accident or was it negligent homicide? And in trying to parse that out, we have this principle that if somebody struck somebody else with an upward blow, it's different than a downward blow, right? If you're chopping wood, the upward blow is like you're just the backswing of the axe. And if you hit somebody in the face with that because they walked up behind you, like that's really accidental. Like you had no idea when you were taking the backswing that could hit somebody. You didn't imagine that. On the downward swing, right, when you're swinging the axe into the firewood that you're chopping, for example, if that blow struck somebody and killed them, now you could see it's a much stronger case for negligence because now you struck somebody in the path that you were aiming to hit. So if you were so careless that somehow your downward swing killed a person, much better case that you're negligent. So if it's the upward swing, it's an accident, nothing happens to you. Maybe you have to pay damages, but you're not exiled to a city of refuge. If it happened on the downward swing, and it wasn't premeditated murder, but somehow it was an unwitting transgression, but it happened in a downward swing, That's where you're exiled to the city of refuge, which is the only place in the Holy Land in ancient times where you would be safe from the avenger of blood, meaning the family that's coming to take vengeance on you, the family of the victim. Okay, so the Torah made this distinction in certain cases, right? Like for instance, Shabbos. If you intentionally desecrate Shabbos and you were warned, that's a death penalty offense. If you unintentionally, unwittingly desecrated Shabbos, so there is a sacrifice when the temple is standing that you could bring for that, a sin offering, a chatas. Okay, so there's these distinctions between witting and unwitting. But in terms of killing with an upward motion, there the Torah maybe doesn't specify distinction between witting and unwitting. It's just assumed that it's unwitting if it's an upward motion. Right? So they say this principle that one cannot pay in lieu of execution applies only when one intentionally killed him in an upward motion, intentionally but with an upward motion, for which no atonement happens to be designated in the Torah for its unwitting performance, right? If it's unwitting and upward, you're off the hook. So, but if you did it intentionally with an upward motion, maybe that's where you can't get out of execution with paying some money. However, with regard to one who intentionally killed him in a downward motion, in a downward motion, there the Torah makes a distinction between witting and unwitting, for which atonement, i.e. exile, is designated if it was unwitting, if you did it unintentionally. If it was intentional, it's murder, it's death penalty, not exile. In that case, let us say, so let us take money from him and exempt him. Therefore, the phrase, eni cherem, teaches us that even in that case, there is no payment in lieu of execution. Recall that the idea here is that when the Torah does not specify a principle of law, and the sages have to derive it from related verses, they're going to be very careful not to over-legislate, and that's why they're drawing very, very fine distinctions and making sure that any principle of law that they derive is sourced in the Torah and sourced properly. Rava said to him, that principle is derived from that which the sage of the school of Chizkiah taught. As the sage of the school of Chizkiah taught, the verse juxtaposes the cases of one who smites a person and one who smites an animal. This is where we were a few days ago. But because there is a verse that says one who smites an animal shall pay, one who smites a person shall die. Right? And so from there we learn the idea that whenever you are guilty of killing somebody's animal, right, nobody's executed for killing an animal. Even if they did it on purpose, they pay financial damages, money damages. Somebody who kills a person, if he did it intentionally and he was warned, he's subject to the death penalty. But from that verse, we learn that perhaps, right, this is one view, that the Torah has separated killing animals, money damages. Killing people, corporal punishment, and not money damages. So if you're in the realm of corporal punishment, you're not in the realm of financial damages. So just as in the case of one who smites an animal, you did not distinguish between one who did so unwittingly and one who did so intentionally, between one who acted with intent and one who acted with no intent, between one who smites in the course of a downward motion and one who smites in the course of an upward motion. In all of those cases, it is not to exempt him from paying money, but rather to obligate him to pay money. Anytime you kill an animal, you're going to pay money. So too, in the case of one who smites a person, maybe we should not distinguish between one who did so unwittingly or one who did so intentionally, between one who acted with intent and one who acted with no intent, between one who smites in the course of a downward motion and one who smites in the course of an upward motion. And in all of these cases, it is not to obligate him to pay money, but rather to exempt him from paying money, and that money damages would never be involved when the damage done was that a person ended up dead. So apparently one who kills another in any manner is exempt from payment, and therefore no additional verse is required to derive that principle. Rather, Rami Bar Chama said that the phrase eni cherem from Leviticus 27:29 is necessary, as it might enter your mind to say that this law, that one who is liable to be executed is exempt from paying money damages, applies only in a case where one blinded another's eye and killed him with the same blow. So now what they're getting at, already we've established that the law, an eye for an eye, is not physical punishment. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for life, right? that actually means an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth means money damages. Elsewhere, the sages prove at length that an eye for an eye does not mean that the one who put out somebody else's eye gets his eye put out. One of the main reasons for that is, how are you going to enforce it, right? Maybe it was in a fight, maybe it was an accident, maybe it was crazy, but if somebody ended up losing an eye, and by the way, I can't believe we're discussing this today because we came out of Shabbos and I just read that a attempted assassination happened today to Salman Rushdie, the author, who after he wrote a book a couple decades ago, the Ayatollah in Iran put a fatwa out on his head, and today somebody tried to enforce that fatwa and stabbed Salman Rushdie in upstate New York, 75-year-old man. The attempted killer was 24 years old and stabbed him several times, and it seems likely that he's going to lose his eye. But he survived the assassination attempt. So if you thought that eye for an eye meant that this attempted killer would now have to lose his eye, the problem is that the court, in extracting that man's eye, might kill him. And if you put out an eye, you're not subject to the death penalty. You should certainly be punished severely, but it's not the death penalty. So an eye for an eye was always defined as figure out what the value is of that eye and pay it as money. So here, what if somebody killed someone else and in the course of killing him also put out the eye? In other words, if this man today was successful in killing Salman Rushdie, he would be subject to the death penalty. And would he also be subject to paying the value of the eye? Perhaps only in that case where his action both put out an eye and killed, is where he would be excused from paying the financial damage because his life is going to be taken. But in other cases, maybe not. That's what's being explored here. However, in the case of one who blinded another's eye and killed him by means of a different blow, then let us say, take money from him, right? So in fact, this case today, so if he stabbed him in the eye and then stabbed him in the heart, so at the moment of the eye, he became liable to pay money for the eye. And then the second blow, which was the death blow, is the one for which he would have to be executed and receive the death penalty. So maybe since it was two different blows, he would owe money for the eye and the death penalty, perhaps. Therefore, this verse teaches us that this is not the case. So Rava said to him, this case of one who blinded another's eye and killed him is also derived from that which another Tana of the school of Chizkiah taught, as the sage of the school of Chizkiah taught, that the verse states, an eye for an eye, Exodus 21:24, from which it may be inferred, but not an eye and a life for an eye. When he gives his life for killing another while blinding him, he need not pay the worth of the eye as well. And by the way, let us just say, please God, grant a healing to Mr. Rushdie. He suffered a terrible attack, and may he be healed. Rather, after the Gemara rejected the above explanations, Rav Ashi said the phrase "eni cherem" is nonetheless necessary, as it might enter your mind to say, since it is a novel element that the Torah introduced with regard to the payment of the fine. So we're finally back, as we're about to finish our discussion of Mishnah number 2, to where we got into this conversation, the fine of the rapist when he rapes a woman who is at that age, a young woman, more than a minor, less than an adult woman, who is a virgin, and he rapes her. So this special fine applies in addition to all the other monetary damages for her injury, for humiliation, for pain and suffering, etc. So with regard to that fine, that is a novel element that the Torah introduced, this concept of the fine of the rapist, which is not payment for any damage caused, but rather is a Torah decree. So in that case, even though the one who killed, let's say he raped her and killed her, so he's subject to the death penalty for that, for sure, but perhaps because he raped her, the fine still applies, since the fine is not the same as monetary damages. It is its own Torah innovation, as it were. Therefore, this verse teaches us that one who is executed is exempt from payment of the fine as well. So the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbah, who said that this is the law, since it is a novel element that the Torah introduced with regard to the payment of the fine, even though he is killed, he pays the fine. So what does Rabbah do with this phrase, eni cherem? And the Gemara answers, Rabbah holds that with regard to this matter, it is in accordance with the opinion of the first Tana, who disagrees with Rabbi Hanania ben Akiva and explains that the phrase eni cherem teaches that the vow that one takes to donate the valuation of one who is on his way to execution is not binding. It was a little bit convoluted, this discussion, because they were talking about multiple ideas simultaneously in deriving how do we source that one who is executed does not pay. Different sages had different proofs for that. And when we would say, well, this sage relies on this verse and that sage holds differently or holds the same way, but proves it from this verse and that verse. And then once you say that, well, then what does this guy do with the verse that guy uses as a proof text? And then we'd say, well, he needs it for a different principle. And that's why we're sort of simultaneously talking about a bunch of different ideas at once. At any rate, that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Now we open Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 3. With regard to a young woman who was betrothed and divorced, right? So betrothal means that she was, in ancient times, betrothed to be married. She didn't consummate that marriage. She didn't go under the chuppah or sleep with her groom, but he's called her groom even though it was a betrothal, because once they're betrothed, it's not like an engagement in modern times. You could just break it off and go your separate ways. If you're betrothed, you're considered married, even if you haven't consummated the union, and to leave such a marriage requires a bill of divorce. So this happened to a young woman. So, right, she's probably between 12 and 12 and a half years old. In ancient times, that's, a different kind of age. And a lot of people were married at that time 2,000 years ago. Doesn't happen today. At any rate, with regard to a young woman who was betrothed and divorced, and then she was raped, Rabbi Yosei Hagalili says she does not receive payment of the fine for her rape. And Rabbi Kiva says she receives payment of the fine for her rape, and the fine is paid to herself, not to her father, as since she has already been betrothed and divorced, she is no longer subject to her father's authority. Why would Rabbi Yosei Hagalili think that she doesn't get the fine at all, neither her nor her father? Because when she was betrothed, even though she may not have consummated that union with her groom, the fact that she was technically married is enough to remove the legal presumption of virginity. And if she's not a virgin, then she doesn't receive the fine for rape, the special fine. Damages, yes, she definitely gets damages, but this is a different principle. Gemara. What is the rationale for the opinion of Rabbi Yosei Hagalili? It is, as the verse states, if a man finds a young woman who is a virgin, who was not betrothed, from which it may be inferred. So if she was betrothed, she does not have a fine for rape. And right, the Torah specifically says, if this man rapes a young woman who was not betrothed, then he pays the fine and he has to marry her and he can never divorce her. This woman was betrothed and then divorced. So you might say, well, she's not betrothed at the time she was raped. But Rabbi Yossi would see the verse means she had never been betrothed. So that's how he reads it. And the Gemara asks, so how does Rabbi Akiva explain this verse? And the Gemara answers that the verse states, if it is a young woman who was not betrothed, the fine is paid to her father, from which it may be inferred if she was betrothed, the fine is paid to the betrothed woman herself, right? Rabbi Yosei says, the verse says, and she was not betrothed. This woman has been betrothed, so there's no fine. Rabbi Kiva says, the verse states, if she was not betrothed and he rapes her, this fine is paid to her father. Since she had been betrothed, it means that the fine is paid to her rather than her father. The Gemara asks, but if that is so, that the inference from the verse is that the fine is levied on one who rapes a young woman and not on one who rapes a grown woman, an adult woman, so too, there is the law in the latter case that the fine is paid to the grown woman herself. So similarly, with regard to the inference that the fine is levied on one who rapes a virgin and not on one who rapes a non-virgin, so too, there is the law that in the latter case, the fine is paid to the non-virgin herself. Right? So you might say, well, what is the law actually teaching us? Right? Do we have a law that a virgin who is raped receives this fine as opposed to a young woman who is a virgin, in which case her father gets the fine, but if she's a grown woman, she herself gets the fine. What if she's a non-virgin? Does that mean she doesn't get the fine? Or that if she's a virgin, her father gets it, and she's a non-virgin, she gets it, right? Like now that you're parsing it out like this and it's unclear what the if-then implication is, you could take it a number of different ways, is what the Gemara is saying. So how do we know which way to take it? So a distinction of that kind has never been encountered, that if she's a virgin, she gets paid. If she's her father gets paid. If she's a non-virgin, she gets paid. We haven't seen a distinction like that anywhere. So rather, with regard to a grown woman and a non-virgin, the rapist is exempt from paying the fine. He pays damages. He might be subject to the death penalty, but he doesn't pay this particular fine that is only in the case of a young woman who has not betrothed, where the fine is supposed to go to her father. Rabbi Akiva says, okay, but if she had been betrothed and then divorced, the fine goes to her. So maybe, this, according to this argument, Rabbi Akiva is, trying to find a different condition than what's implied by the Torah. So here too, with regard to a betrothed woman, the rapist maybe is exempt from paying the fine. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Akiva would have said to you that this verse, who was not betrothed, is required by him to teach a different law that is taught in a different baraisa. Right? Deuteronomy 22:28, who was not betrothed, this comes to exclude a young woman who was betrothed and divorced and established that she does not receive payment of a fine for her rape. That's the statement of Rabbi Yosei Hagalili, which we just heard in our Mishna. Rabbi Kiva says she receives payment of a fine for her rape, and her fine goes to her father, contrary to the ruling attributed to Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah. So it seems like we have a baraisa that directly contradicts this Mishnah, right? So Mishnahs and baraisas are teachings of the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnaic period. Mishnahs are considered more authoritative than baraisas because Mishnahs made it into the collection of Mishnahs called the Mishnah. And the baraisas are teachings of those same sages that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the editor, the redactor of the Mishnah, did not see fit to include in the Mishnah because maybe they're somehow a little bit less reliable. So you might think, well, if Rabbi Akiva says she gets the payment in the Mishnah and Rabbi Akiva says her father gets the payment in the baraisa, so we just would follow the Mishnah. But let's see what it says. And Rabbi Akiva says that she receives the payment of a fine for her rape and her fine goes to her father, contrary to the ruling attributed to Rabbi Akiva in our Mishnah. And ostensibly, no verse is required to derive this law, as logic dictates that it is so. Since her father is entitled to the money of her betrothal, if she is betrothed before she becomes a grown woman, and likewise her father is entitled to the money of her fine, just as the money of her subsequent betrothal as a young woman, even though she was betrothed and divorced, is paid to her father, so too the money of her fine, although she was betrothed and divorced, is paid to her father. Right? In ancient times, the father had this absolute authority over his daughter, certainly when she was a minor, and still when she was a young woman. Where he, while she was a minor, he could sell her into slavery. And even while she was a young woman, he could betroth her to anyone he wants. He chooses a husband for her. It's not her choice. And if, he's going to receive money from the groom's family for doing that, that money goes to him. So perhaps you would say that therefore the fine should go to him in case she was raped. So if so, and the law can be logically inferred, then why does the verse state who was not betrothed? Now they're reading it as not betrothed just means she's not betrothed at the time that she's raped. Even if she had been betrothed before, if she was then divorced, the father could betroth her again and receive money for that. And if she was betrothed and divorced, she's not betrothed at that moment. And if she was raped at that time, the fine would then accrue to the father and not to her, according to this reading of that law. So why does the verse state who was not betrothed? This verse is free, as it is superfluous in its own context, and it is written to liken another case to it and to derive from it a verbal analogy. It is stated here with regard to a woman who was raped, who was not betrothed. And it is stated below, and if a man seduce a virgin who was not betrothed. So just as here with regard to rape, the Torah specifies the payment is 50 silver pieces, so too below with regard to seduction, the payment is 50. And just as below with regard to seduction, the payment is in silver shekels, as it is written, he shall weigh yishkol money. So too here, the payment is in shekels. Perhaps the Torah is simply telling us the nature of the financial penalty in that case. So the Gemara asks, and Rabbi Akiva, what did you see that led you to utilize the phrase, who was not betrothed, to make a verbal analogy? In other words, when the same phrase appears in two different verses, there's a connection between the laws expressed in those two different verses. That's a verbal analogy. So Rabbi Akiva, what did you see that led you to utilize the phrase, who was not betrothed, for a verbal analogy, and the term virgin to exclude a non-virgin from the fine? Say to the contrary, that the term virgin, which is written with regard to both rape and seduction, that's the term from which we derive the verbal analogy, and not to exclude a non-virgin. And the phrase, who was not betrothed, should be interpreted as Rabbi Yosei Hagalili interpreted it, to exclude a young woman who had been betrothed and divorced from receiving the fine at all. And the Gemara answers, it stands to reason, and now we're on 38b. Tonight's a short page. It stands to reason that the phrase, who was not betrothed, is utilized to derive a verbal analogy and not to exclude one who was betrothed and divorced. Why? Because as even after the divorce, I can still read the phrase, a young woman who is a virgin, as applying to her. A woman could be betrothed and divorced and never have slept with the one to whom she was betrothed, so she's still a virgin. So the Gemara asks, on the contrary, utilize the term virgin to derive a verbal analogy, as even if she is not a virgin, I can still read the phrase, who was not betrothed, as applying to her. And the Gemara answers, it stands to reason that the term virgin excludes a non-virgin, and the phrase, who was not betrothed, is used to derive the verbal analogy. Why? Because this woman who engaged in relations, her body changed, and that woman who was betrothed and divorced, her body did not change, and therefore her status with regard to the fine should similarly not change. Right? They're saying that it seems to be more relevant to this verse that a woman who had marital relations of some sort, and she's no longer virgin, there's something fundamentally different about her now with respect to whether the rapist is liable to pay the fine for raping a virgin or not, as opposed to whether she had been betrothed and divorced or not, which was a change in her legal status, but not a change in her physical self. So the Gemara asks, and from where does Rabbi Yosei Hagalili derive this conclusion with regard to the amount of the payment for seduction and the type of money used in the payment for rape? And the Gemara responds, he derives it from that which was taught in a Baraisa, that it is written with regard to the one who seduces the virgin, that he shall weigh money like the dowry of the virgins. Exodus 22:16, from which it is derived that this fine for seduction will be like the dowry paid to virgins elsewhere for rape. 50 silver coins. And the dowry paid to the virgins for rape will be like this fine for seduction in shekels, right? So that therefore we understand that it's the same amount of money paid in the same kind of currency. New subject. The Gemara comments, it is difficult as there is a contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Akiva and another statement of Rabbi Akiva. In our Mishna, he ruled that the fine for the rape of a young woman who was betrothed and divorced is paid to the woman herself. And in the Baraisa, Rabbi Akiva ruled that it is paid to her father. So we have Rabbi Akiva himself has contradictory statements, one in the Mishna and the other in the Baraisa. Can we reconcile them? And the Gemara answers, the reason we have contradictory statements of Rabbi Akiva in the Mishna and in the Baraisa is because these are conflicting traditions of two Tanaim in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. In other words, two later sages than Rabbi Akiva, both were trying to make a teaching in accordance with Rabbi Akiva, but they came to a different conclusion. And the Gemara observes, granted, the statement of Rabbi Akiva of the Mishnah is reasonable, as a verbal analogy does not come and divert the verse from its plain meaning entirely. The plain meaning of the phrase, who was not betrothed, is that there is a difference between a young woman who was betrothed, who receives payment of the fine, and one who was not betrothed, whose father receives payment of the fine. However, according to Rabbi Akiva's statement in the Baraisa, does a verbal analogy come and divert the verse from its plain meaning entirely and teach that there is no difference at all between a young woman who was betrothed and one who was not? So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, interpret the verse as who is not betrothed, who is not betrothed, as opposed to who was not betrothed. It does not mean that the young woman was not betrothed in the past, rather that she is not currently betrothed. So the Gemara asks, there is no need for a verse to derive that the rapist is exempt from paying a fine if the young woman is betrothed, as the rape of a betrothed young woman is punishable by stoning, as the rapist is therefore certainly exempt from paying the fine. Why is the rapist who rapes a betrothed woman subject to a different punishment than the one who rapes a single woman, right, who is not betrothed? Because the Torah said if he rapes a woman who is not betrothed, his punishment is the fine, and he must marry her, and he can never divorce her, and he must support her for the rest of his life. But if she's already married, then he raped and had sex with a married woman, and the only penalty for him is the death penalty. And if it's the death penalty, then there is no fine. So there's no need to say that one who rapes a betrothed woman who is currently betrothed, is going to have a fine or doesn't have a fine. There is no fine possible because he's subject to the death penalty. Rather, when it says who is not betrothed, it must mean who was not betrothed in the past, because it's obvious that she's not betrothed now. And it might enter your mind to say, since it is a novel element that the Torah introduced with regard to the payment of a fine, that even though he is killed, he also pays the fine. Therefore, the verse teaches us that one who is executed is exempt from payment of the fine, as we've learned at length. I'm almost done. If you got questions or comments, please get them in. So the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbah, who said that this is indeed the law, since it is a novel element that the Torah introduced with regard to payment of a fine, even though he killed, he pays the fine. Right? Everyone else of the sages said, no, if you're executed, you don't pay the fine. But Rabbah says you do pay the fine. So according to Rabbah, how are we going to read this passage? Right? Since according to Rabbah, who said that, yes, that is the law. Since it is a novel element that the Torah introduced with regard to paying a fine, even though he is killed, he pays. So then what is there to say? What is derived from the verse that says that there is no fine if the young man is currently betrothed? And the Gemara answers, Rabbah holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva of our Mishna, who interpreted the verse as it is written, meaning that it is referring to one who was betrothed and divorced, that she receives the fine rather than her father. And the sages taught, with regard to a young woman who was raped, to whom is her fine paid? It is paid to her father. And some say it is paid to her. And the Gemara asks, to her, why? The verse explicitly states that the fine is paid to her father. And Rav Chisda said, here we are dealing with a young woman who was betrothed and divorced, and these Tanaim in the Baraisa disagree in the dispute between Rabbi Akiva of the Mishnah and Rabbi Akiva of the Baraisa with regard to whom the rapist pays the fine in that case. And that's where we're going to leave off the discussion tonight. And with God's help, we'll continue it tomorrow at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Let me see if I can take any questions. On Kesubos, page 38. Christo. A literal eye for an eye would be so problematic if a person with one eye damaged a person with both eyes. Brilliant. That's also part of the discussion when they make that proof. Exactly. If a person blinded another person, and left him with one eye, but the one who was the attacker already only had one eye, so taking his eye would have a very different outcome and consequence than the one who lost an eye but can still see. And that's just another one of the reasons why an eye for an eye in the Torah specifically means you pay money damages and not physical violence for physical violence. Sharon adds, plus the value of an eye is going to be so subjective. The valuation of an eye of a professional photographer versus a musician, for example. Great point. Jerry Hallberg, does the non-virgin have to marry, or does she have a choice? She has a choice. She doesn't have to marry this rapist, or will she and her child be shamed, and are these laws currently in effect? These laws are not. They're in effect in the sense that that's the law, but they never get enforced in this way because so much else has happened and so many other aspects of the law have changed, right? A very important principle that we have to always keep in mind is that in ancient times, pretty much prison and jail was not one of the punishments. And in cases of death, the avenger of blood was a well-accepted punishment, right? That this kind of vigilante family would come and exact justice. And that was a big part of the system. So that had a profound effect, sort of distinguishing the system in ancient times from our system today, where prison is a huge part, not of Jewish law, but of, secular law in every country, including Israel. And it's a very established, important principle in Torah law that the law of the land is the law, right? So Jews must follow the law in the country where they reside. You can't ignore the law. The law of the land is the law, unless there's a direct contradiction. Like if, God forbid, America passed a law that all Americans, must bow to an idol. It would never happen. But imagine if they did that. It certainly has happened at other times and places in history. So if they passed a law that created forced idolatry, right, we don't follow that law. And a Jew is expected to die rather than commit idolatry. But in terms of, the laws of contracts, the laws of criminal laws, etc., you have to follow those laws, right? So if a rapist is going to receive 20 years, that's the law, right? And it's now taken off the table that woman, first of all, the woman who was raped is always her choice. Very much, by the way, a difference between if that rapist is Jewish or not, because if he's not Jewish, then there is no marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew. That's one of those things where, obviously in American law, Jews and non-Jews can get married, but such a marriage is not recognized under Jewish law. I mean, that's the way it is. So there's a lot of, very nuanced intersection between the laws of the land and the laws of the Jews. But right now we're studying the laws sort of as they were intended to be lived out in the ancient Holy Land of Israel, which was being run by Torah law, as it were, as opposed to out in the diaspora, where people are subject to the secular law of the land in which they live. Okay, so Jerry asked, please forgive me for asking this. What if it is a male who is violated and not a female, or is this travesty kept on the down low? Again, please forgive the question. Well, I mean, this is one of those things where under Jewish law, sodomy is a death penalty offense, right? So and what's not possible, right, is that the rapist could marry the victim, right, and support the victim all the days of the rapist's life, and he can never divorce her, because if two men are involved, Jewish law does not recognize that kind of a marriage. So that's off the table, and it's very much a death penalty offense. But if the death penalty couldn't be enforced, there would be no fine for rape, which is a specific case, but there certainly would be damages, pain and suffering, injury, medical costs, loss of livelihood, etc. It could be a very substantial financial payment. It's just not the technical fine, which is the very limited case of raping the young woman still in their father's authority who is not betrothed and possibly was never betrothed and divorced. That's a disagreement between Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Akiva. Okay, that's what we have today. This is a tough tractate. It really is. It's so much easier to talk about the laws of contracts and acquisition, etc. These are painful, human, emotional types of cases, and our minds kind of recoil at doing a kind of, just very rational legal analysis of which laws apply and which don't, when we understand that the underlying case would be so fraught with pain and suffering and trauma. But nevertheless, what the sages are discussing here is just what does the Torah say and what would we do? And you could see that all of the cases that we're really talking about are hypothetical cases. Very rare that they say, and an incident occurred in which. Usually these kinds of very tough, traumatic sounding cases are just hypotheticals so that we understand what is the underlying law and where does it come from. And I hope that makes it a little bit easier to understand for all of us. Have a great night. Oh, God's help. See you tomorrow, 6 p.m. Pacific for the next page.